Neil, just one quick query. Once I begin, I can share my screen, right? Because I have a PPT with some stuff.
Yeah, you can.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Hi and good evening. Welcome to an evening of ISHQ. ISHQ, as you know, is an acronym that stands for Issues in Society, History and Queerness, and is a cross-disciplinary speaker series that hosts scholars, thinkers, activists from wide-ranging disciplines throughout the academic year here at Ashoka. And today we have with us the fabulous Oishik Sircar, who is a professor of law at Jindal Global Law School. Oishik Sircar is the co-editor of New Intimacies, Old Desires, Law, Culture, and Queer Politics in New Liberal Times, and is the author of a fantastic new book called Violent Modernities, Cultural Lives of Law in the New India, which all of you should get a copy of. As a human rights law researcher, Professor Sircar has worked with Amnesty International, the South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center, and the Center for Communication and Development Studies. Welcome, Oishik Sircar. The title of today's talk is Scenes of Contradictory Inheritances, or Queering Without Queer Theory. And what a better day to talk about the law in our lives than the Constitution Day, which marks the day the Constitution was adopted by the Assembly in 1949. Just a quick note on the format for ISHQ. Oishik Sircar will talk for the first 30 minutes of the event, and the last leg, the last 30 minutes of the presentation will take up your questions for a Q&A session. And so if you have any question that you want to ask Professor Sircar, please feel free to use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. Right, that's all from my side. Professor Sircar, all to you.
Thank you very much, Neil, for this very generous and quite a flattering introduction. And hi, everyone whoever's logged in for this. When I received the invitation for this talk, it didn't occur to me that it coincides with Constitution Day. So initially, the abstract that I'd shared was meant to attend to a different set of ideas. And if you're here because the abstract sounded interesting or not so, you might be disappointed because just to be more apposite for the purpose of the day in question, I decided to speak to a certain set of concerns surrounding the Constitution. So the promise of the abstract is going to get betrayed in what I will share, but I will try and maintain some contingent fidelity to the title of the talk. So I'll hold on to the title and try and see what I have to say will be more or less in alignment with it. What I will talk about today, much of this emerges out of the book that Neil mentioned that is just out. So I'm drawing on some of the thoughts shared in that book and adding some new ideas. This is not a paper, so pardon me for any incoherence that might be present in what I'm saying. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a second. Okay, I hope everyone can see it. Okay, so today is Constitution Day, but it wasn't called Constitution Day until a few years back. The day used to be referred to as the National Law Day. to mark the adoption of the Indian Constitution on November 26th, 1949. But in 2015, when the year that marked Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's 125th birth anniversary, the BJP government and Prime Minister Modi decided to re-Christian National Law Day as the Constitution Day. And, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think the contradiction is quite apparent in the celebration of this day as the National Constitution Day in terms of the way in which it has been re-Christianed by the BJP government. But I'll leave it at that. I'll come back to the question of the Constitution in a bit. Let me say a little bit about the title, particularly the portion that appears in parentheses. Queering without queer theory would refer to a way of thinking about a way of seeing the world that does not necessarily hold itself to an identifiable source, and that source isn't queer as an identity category or queer theory as a conceptual framework. Rather, what I understand as queer theory in the way what I understand as queering in the way I use it is an orientation or a perception which, amongst other things, is interested in attending to and taking responsibility for contradictory inheritances, which I understand is a condition of our life itself. As I continue, I think what I mean by contradictory inheritances will become apparent. So to repeat again, queering is a way of seeing the world, a way of perceiving the world, orienting yourself to the world that does not singularly owe itself to an identity category. So there isn't a prerequisite for being queer to be able to engage in the practice of queering. Neither is it singularly drawing on a pre-existing conceptual framework in named form called queer theory. So it's not that queer theory exists there. I use it and try and look at things differently. This is not to say that identity questions or the conceptual framework are unhelpful. All that I'm saying is that those are not determinate sources or identifiable sources that you can trace the practice of queering back to. So I'm going to describe two scenes of contradictory inheritances from the vantage of the queering orientation. The first scene is the Constitution of India, and the second scene is going to be the scene of writing legal theory. Both of these instances don't require the presence of questions around sexuality or subjects who carry the markers of being despised because of their identity categories. And that is in many ways what queering is interested in, that it's interested in thinking about what happens to the queer orientation when it leaves its home base of sexuality. So if you think about the Constitution, the contradictory inheritance that I am interested in attending to is the coexistence of promise and betrayal. Now, of course, when we think about Constitution Day, we think about it as a moment of celebration. the nature of celebration commemorates a whole range of things. Of course, it commemorates the marking of India as a sovereign nation state. It also commemorates the work of the Constituent Assembly, the drafting committee led by Dr. Ambedkar, and the extremely progressive document that the Constitution is. But the Constitution wasn't necessarily looked at as a homogeneous document of absolute promise, even at its inaugural moment. So consider these two instances. Many of you might be conversant or might have read Saadat Hasan Manto's short story, The New Constitution or Naya Kanun, where the story, which refers to the Government of India Act of 1935, talks about a Tongawala called Ustad Mangu, who's extremely excited about the fact that the subcontinent is going to have a new constitution. But as the story progresses and leads to its climactic conclusion, that promise that Mangu holds on to, that illusory promise that Mangu holds on to, is completely betrayed. Mangu gets into a fight with a Gora, a white man, thinking that the new constitution will come to his protection, but he is in fact locked up. And when he's being locked up, he keeps shouting, "But we have a new constitution." And everybody tells him, no, it's the same old constitution. So the story sets up, this contradictory relationship between promise and betrayal that have in many ways remained a part of our contradictory inheritances of how we think about and attach ourselves to the Constitution. So if Manto spoke about the contradictory relationship between the illusory promise of rights versus substantive freedoms that rights can bring in the context of the 1935 Act, which in fact didn't have the fundamental rights chapter. It was only advancing, amongst other things, a certain sense of local governance powers to the provinces. Ambedkar in 1936, which is just a year after the enactment of the Government of India Act, self-publishes his undelivered speech called Annihilation of Caste. And the opening of Annihilation of Caste is actually a very sharp set of arguments about the contradictory relationship between political and social reform, and speaking to the possibility of India gaining independence from the British. Ambedkar points out in very compelling terms that political and economic independence will not bring about independence from the social strictures of caste. So the inaugural moments are marked by an acknowledgement of contradictions. And these contradictions continue in a certain sense through the period between November 26th and January 26th, when the Constitution comes into force, because on November 15th, Ambedkar delivers his last speech to the Constituent Assembly, and in fact uses the language of contradictions to say that on 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. This is a reiteration of the opening arguments in Annihilation of Caste that he returns to in this closing speech, and in fact uses the vocabulary of contradictions. Interestingly, if Ambedkar was speaking to, and so was, Manto in his short story, speaking to the contradictions built into the Constitution, we also had the Hindu right at that time disclaiming the Constitution of India as not being Indian enough. And so November 30th, that's just about 2 weeks after Ambedkar delivers his last speech to the Constituent Assembly, we have an editorial published in the RSS mouthpiece, The Organizer, which says this: "But in our Constitution, there is no mention of the unique constitutional development in ancient Bharat." Hold on to that word because I'm going to return to it in a bit. Manu's laws were written long before Lycurgus of Sparta or Solon of Persia. To this day, his laws as enunciated in the Manusmriti excite the admiration of the world and elicit spontaneous obedience and conformity. But to our constitutional pundits, that means nothing. So that the Constitution has not inherited this legacy that the RSS considers to be a part of ancient Bharat is understood as the Constitution's betrayal by the Hindu right at that time. Of course, we see two sets of contradictions at work here. Then one is kind of the Ambedkarite notion of the promise and betrayal that is produced through the contradictions between the Constitution's commitment to political emancipation, whereas it remains a task to bridge the gap between political emancipation and social emancipation, which in many ways is captured in the Ambedkarite notion of constitutional morality, that it is something that needs to be cultivated, a term that has been around for, since the time, Ambedkar used it, but entered more popular parlance in the wake of the Delhi High Court judgment that initially read down Section 377. The other contradiction we see in the outsider position of the Hindu right, from the RSS, considering the Constitution to be a document that betrays its attachment to the legacy of ancient Bharat. Now, if the task has been over these 70 or more years to bridge this gap, this gap that Ambedkar pointed out between political emancipation and social emancipation, what do we see as the contradictions in the Constitution today? What are our contradictory inheritances? Interestingly, the betrayal of the legacy that the RSS points out in its November 30 editorial finds its way into the Constitution in a pretty well-articulated form, as I will show. So let's hold on to a simple way of thinking about the current promise, current promise that we'd want to consider as a key aspect of what the Constitution, or why the Constitution is important for us. And that's contained in one of the Constitution's most popular and well-known articles, which is Article 21, which protects the life and personal liberty not only of citizens, but anybody who is in the territory of India, as has been later interpreted by the Supreme Court. And it says, no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. Keeping aside the quibbles that many of us might have about the use of the masculine expression his in Article 21, in the protests and public demonstrations that we saw in the light of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the NRC, Shaheen Bagh, around that time, Save Our Constitution was really a rallying cry. And in many ways, what one wanted to save was this promise of the Constitution, that it is a guard against executive fiat that can, in fact, unleash violence on the rightless, or one whose citizenship is, can be snatched away, through executive fiat. But what exactly are we saving when we say we save the Constitution? The betrayal is written into the Constitution itself. And this is not the kind of betrayal that the RSS quotation that I shared earlier talks about. Article 22, which comes right after Article 21, is in many ways the civil rights clause of the Constitution of India. What it protects citizens against is arrest and detention in certain cases. So it, simply put, protects the rights of the arrested person or one who has been detained by the state. And these are extremely important protections that the Constitution advances. So if you see clauses 1 and 2 that go with Article 22, it gives us some of the very, very important rights, like that you need to be, you need to be informed about your grounds of arrest. You need to be defended by a lawyer of your choice. You have to be produced in front of a magistrate within 24 hours of arrest, so on and so forth, right? So these are extremely important civil rights protections that Article 22 advances. But look at Article 22, Clause 3, which is an exception clause built into the protection advanced by Article 22. And Clause 3 says, nothing in Clause 1 and 2, nothing in Clause 1 and 2 shall apply to two categories of persons. A, to any person who for the time being is an enemy alien. So through law or through the production of suspect people, if you can be declared to be an enemy alien, you can legally, constitutionally be denied the protections advanced in clauses 1 and 2. Second, to any person who is arrested or detained under any law providing for preventive detention. And what is a law for preventive detention? We have the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, in its current avatar, and in fact also in its previous avatar that was enacted by the coalition headed by the Congress, and all other such special security legislations whose acronyms have in fact become quite popular today. We can think about the TADA, the POTA, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, and of course, the very controversial AFSPA, or the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, in operation in frontier states like Kashmir and Manipur. Now, what do we make of Article 22.3? It's an interesting moment of how we would want to inherit the Constitution at this time. I've shared this image by Bekari Prasad, showing the Bhima Koregaon 16, all of whom have been arrested under the UAPA. And our protests against the arrests cite the Constitution, right? We think about it as an abrogation of the Constitution. What we actually see is that the very law under which these arrests have taken place is in fact made valid through constitutional imprimatur. And never ever in the history of independent India, every time a constitutional challenge has been raised against any preventive detention law, any special security legislation, has the Supreme Court of India ever declared any such law unconstitutional. It has in fact held the constitutionality up of all of these laws. So if some of these laws have gone, like TADA, for example, they've gone not because they were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but they've gone because they lapsed. And just on the aside to mention the big image here in the Bekari Prasad sketch is that of Mahesh Raut, possibly the youngest arrested under the UAPA as part of the Bhima Koregaon arrests, who was in fact denied bail yesterday, again, on the basis of a constitutional imprimatur that continues to uphold the UAPA as a valid law. Not only that, in the wake of Father Stan Swami's institutional murder, as it were, our very progressive Supreme Court Judge Justice Chandrachud came out with a statement of criticism against the UAPA, saying that it should not be used to stifle dissent. The statement did not speak of the fundamental problem with a special security legislation like the UAPA, but just that it shouldn't be used to stifle dissent. So it shouldn't be misused. So if it's not misused, what should it be used for then? So we cannot necessarily speak about saving the Constitution today without attending to the fact that if we save the Constitution, we will have to inherit this contradiction that is part and parcel of the very Constitution that we want to save. The promise of Article 21 is continuously betrayed by the presence of Article 22.3. Upendra Bakshi, whose works have inspired a lot of my scholarship and thinking, has referred to Article 22.3 as a part of a certain kind of constitutionalism that he calls Gulag constitutionalism, that it opens up the possibilities that were present during the Soviet Gulag to be reenacted under conditions of peaceful times in postcolonial India. That Article 22.3, in fact, is a direct opportunity for the state to legitimize torture under conditions of preventive detention custody. Let me come to another set of contradictions, and this connects back to the earlier point that I had made about the RSS, disappointment. And RSS is disappointment, as that earlier, the court showed us was about the fact that the progressive constitution, the liberal constitution, the ostensibly secular constitution, I say ostensibly secular because at the time of its adoption, the word secular wasn't in the preamble at that time, betrays the ancient wisdom of Bharat. But interestingly, the Constitution opens with Article 1, Clause 1, with the sentence, India, that is Bharat. And while the Constitution makes no further mention of what this equivalence between India and Bharat seems to suggest, we've had commentators and scholars reading that articulation as a certain commitment to an idea of the Akhand imagination. And as Bakshi points out powerfully in this quote from a piece called Memory and Rightlessness that he wrote in 2003, and it's worth reading out aloud, because the words are important. He asks, does the expression India that is Bharat contain codes of memory and identity of some vision of pre-British, even millenarian Hindu empire and civilization? Is this a certain kind of revivalist imagination that the Constitution inaugurates? What would the word Bharat mean, for example, to a Konyak Naga, a Bhil, a Santhal, and a Bodo person or woman? What would this mean to India's Islamic peoples, among them the Bohras, the Mios, Khojas, the Ahmadiyas, the Shias, and Sunnis? And what may this notion convey to Indian Christians and Parsis and the microscopic Jewish communities? And how may we relate the idea of Bharat to the diasporic Tibetan, Pakistani, and East Bengal Bangladeshi migrants to India after the independence? How may be one an Indian without at the same time being a Bharati? What mix of human rights and rightlessness does this all signify? And if the idea of Bharat in its Akhand imagination is a certain kind of cartographic promise of sorts, and look at the image here of the right-wing Hindu imagination of the Akhand Bharat, it is a certain kind of cartographic promise. And even if the RSS considered at that time the Constitution to be a betrayal, the Constitution seems to have in fact held onto this promise of the Akhand cartography. And the Akhand cartography in fact takes particularly contradictory shapes if we think about it in more current contexts. So I'm talking about, the date 6/9/2018, the Nafteed Johar judgment comes out, and social media is flooded with images of celebration. And these images of celebration over and over again use the map, the political map of what we understand as India to talk about why this is such an important national moment. In fact, the judgment was celebrated as a decolonizing moment. But the decolonizing moment, in fact, reinforces a certain imagination of the cartographic boundaries that continue to think about Kashmir as an integral part of India. And we know, or many of us might know, what has happened since then in the way in which the decriminalization of Section 377 has in fact given rise to imaginations of extending queer rights to Kashmir, as if Kashmir was an integral part of India. So what are we inheriting here really when we think about the decolonizing moment of 377 being decriminalized, and the popular imagination seems to map onto the cartographic promise of a certain kind of Akhand Bharat in these depictions. I had a closing comment because this is initially what the talk was about. The queering orientation, when directed at an object outside, as it were, like the Constitution and the contradictions surrounding it, is one way in which we can direct this orientation. But the production of legal theory has for very long also used the queering orientation, not in named form, at its own knowledge production practices. And I want to end, it's a slightly jarring a digression from the conversation so far, but the connection really is that it is not merely, queering is not merely an orientation that is directed at things outside of us that we can, look at and accuse of being bad, contradictory, so on and so forth. It is very much, or has been very much a part of particular strands of legal knowledge production. And much before, and some of you might be aware of the expression auto theory that's been popularized since Maggie Nelson's wonderful book, The Argonauts, came out, or if you've read Paul B. Preciado's work in translation in English, from where Maggie Arnott, in fact, picks up the idea of auto theory for her book, Argonauts, much before auto theory, in fact, became the term in vogue in the way in which queer writing takes place. Within legal theory, particularly in its kind of critical avatar, we've had the work of Patricia Williams, who has attended to a form of writing. Again, she's not a queer theorist. She can be considered to be a critical race theorist, and attended to a form of writing that brings the theoretical and the autobiographical together. And one of the reasons why she does this is, again, to attend to the questions of contradictory inheritances in thinking about the positionality of the producer of legal theory. I'm going to end with this quick story, that can be drawn out from her very, very important piece on being the object of property. It opens with an inaugural contradiction, much like the inaugural contradiction that I talked about in the context of the Constitution. And this is the first. This is what the first section is called, on being invisible reflections. There's a certain kind of tension between the presence of these two lines. Can you, in fact, find a reflection of yourself if you are invisible? Patricia Williams undertakes that task in this in this piece by talking about how she goes in search of a history, or her own history, in the archives, to think about, where does my family come from if I think about myself as a Black person in white America. And in doing so, she wanted to make herself visible, find herself in a history that's kind of exiled her in the larger context of American history and American legal history as well. And in that search, she encounters what she calls is a profoundly troubling paradox. And I'll just end with this story. And this is the story that she talks about in the opening section of this piece. So Patricia Williams gets through Harvard Law School, and and she's very scared. She's scared because she thinks she's going to be not only, one of those very few women in a particularly almost all male institution, but also she's going to be possibly the only Black woman in that space. And so she's terrified and petrified about this possibility. I mean, she's overjoyed, of course, that she's gotten through Harvard Law School, but she's also very scared. And her mother, senses that she's very scared and comes to her aid and says, you shouldn't be scared because you have the blood of lawyers in you. And on hearing this, Patricia Williams is absolutely, gobsmacked in a sense. How can I have the blood of lawyers in me? And her mother tells her that your great-great-grandmother was taken in as a slave woman by a white slave owner who forcibly impregnated her. And he's part of your legacy, and he was a lawyer. And so never let anyone make you feel small when you enter the hallowed halls of Harvard Law School. And Patricia Williams says that this moment for her is a moment that demands that she consider something to be a part of her inheritance that has in fact historically produced her disinheritance. And she ends thus ends the first section thus with this quotation, with these lines, where she writes, reclaiming that from which one has been disinherited is a good thing, right? That's what her mother was asking her to do. Self-possession in the full sense of that expression is the companion to self-knowledge. Yet, claiming for myself a weft of whose genesis is my own disinheritance is a profoundly troubling paradox. And I'm ending on this note because this profoundly troubling paradox confronts us when we think about our attachment to the Constitution of India as well. And it's a paradox of contradictory inheritances that we cannot will away. We cannot necessarily romanticize the Constitution without looking at its gangrenous heart in Article 22.3, for example. And it is a condition that we'll possibly have to figure out how to live with, rather than thinking about it as an impediment that can be overcome through more progressive judgments from the Supreme Court, for example, in the future. And if I see any worth in queering as an orientation, the worth lies in being able to not only confront these profoundly troubling paradoxes, but being able to actually take responsibility for living with these contradictory inheritances, living with a condition of continuous fracture, as it were. Okay, I'll end there. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Sircar, for such an important and riveting talk. The first question goes like this. Do you think that even the critical legal left has become complacent in its engagement with the contradictory inheritances of the Constitution, particularly in its repeated appeal to the Supreme Court by maintaining lasting faith in the Constitution?
That's a really helpful and important question. My first response would be, I don't know what the critical left is. I don't know whether there is a homogeneous way of thinking about who constitutes the critical left. But if there are leftists who think in critical terms, because all leftists don't think in critical terms, we can see trends where in trying to respond to the totalitarian turns that the state is taking, be it India or elsewhere, there has been a recourse to the liberal avenues that have been presented to us by a document like the Constitution. Now, is that a co-option, or is that strategy? I cannot offer judgment on that. If the person who's asking the question is, you might already be aware that, particularly in the American context, a book called Left Critique, Left Liberalism, edited by Wendy Brown and Janet Haley, speak to exactly this problem that you are pointing out, that what happens when critical leftists take recourse of liberal means to respond to injustices. Is this a moment of failure for the critical left because it's not able to use its own tools? So we are in many ways, in the Indian context as well, caught between the revolution and the Constitution. It seems like the middle path ends up being kind of holding on to the idea of revolution as a normative aspiration. It's almost the unattainable utopia on the one hand. But to do your everyday work, you need a material document to hold the state to account, and that's the Constitution. So as a matter of strategy, I think that's important, and there's much to be learned from. But does it not produce co-option? Of course it does. But what doesn't produce co-option? I don't know whether we are outside of arrangements where we are constantly being co-opted. Yeah, so that's what I would say.
Thank you, Professor Sircar. The next question is, how do you understand the import of gender in the Constitution, especially in light of the Nalsa judgment?
Sorry, I lost a bit of what you
said.
Sorry,
how do you understand the import of gender in the Constitution, especially in light of the Nalsa judgment?
I think there are two ways to think about a response to this question. One is, what does the Constitution say about gender? We know that it doesn't use that term. Article 15 uses the term sex. And it can be read now in the light of both Nalsa, but also the string of 377 judgments that sex can include gender and sexual orientation. So there's been a certain kind of interpretive expansion of that term that has taken place. But we didn't have to wait until that interpretive expansion to actually see how Article 15, particularly not just 15.1, but 15.3, in fact, has been used historically to attend to the quote-unquote gender question, because it allows the state to pass what is referred to as progressive forms of discrimination, to alleviate structural inequalities produced by conditions of gender, caste, or other forms of discrimination that are mentioned in Article 15.1. This has, of course, also had protectionist responses from the state. So again, there's a certain kind of contradiction built into Article 15.1. On the initial reading of 15.1 says no discrimination on the ground of sex, even if you want to think about the word sex to include gender or sexuality. When you get to the later clause in the Constitution, which empowers the state to legislate progressive forms of discrimination, we have seen instances of Article 15.3 being used to, for example, pass labor laws that say that women can't work in factories at night, as a way of saying that that's how the state is going to protect them. So Article 15.3 then has gone in both directions, one in advancing protective forms of legislation specific to gender. On the other hand, it's also advanced protectionist forms of legislation. Ratna Kapoor and Brenda Cosman, in one of their earlier pieces called Through the Looking Glass of Feminism, which was published in the first issue of the National Law School Journal, the piece was a feminist evaluation of the Constitution of India, particularly Article 15 amongst others, and which is a detailed exploration of what work the Constitution does, and they actually demonstrate these contradictions. With regard to Nalsa, very quickly, because that's the other part of the question, I think, and this is something that has been a worry that critical leftists, whoever that category might include, have struggled with, and the struggle lies in the fact that every rights articulation and recognition requires the production of categories. It's built into the way in which rights work. You cannot not actually claim rights without the production of categories. And production of categories produce, again, contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, they can emancipate because you have a language to make yourself legible in front of the state, where the state historically might have invisibilized you. But it is also, the production of categories also produce conditions of regulation and discipline. And I think both NALSA and the Transgender Rights Act in many ways come together to perform this contradictory task of both making visible a certain category that requires rights protection, but that rights protection is made contingent upon gatekeepers who will now say whether you qualify to be a part of that category or not. But what I want to say is that this is not unique to either, NALSA or the act in question. Every rights articulation necessarily struggles with this negotiation between emancipation or recognition on the one hand and regulation and discipline on the other. Again, this is the contradictory inheritance of rights. I don't think one can operate outside of these. I mean, you'll have to think about a post-national arrangement to, step out of the emancipation regulation tension.
That was very interesting. Thank you, Professor. Next question is, how can the law learn from queering as a practice, as opposed to queering in the classroom, queering as a practice?
Now, I don't think about the relationship between queering and the law as one where one realm is impoverished in a certain way, law being the impoverished realm, and queering, be it queer thoughts, queer theory, experiential knowledge, as being necessarily, carrying a certain kind of higher wisdom that law can gain from. One of the reasons I don't think in that way is because that way of thinking, and this doesn't just apply to queer theory, but any other kind of so-called critical theoretical framework, be it feminist theory or Marxism, so on and so forth, is that it becomes particularly instrumentalist when we think about this either in activist terms or pedagogical terms. Because then what we say is that the law is bereft of any of its own wisdom, and all of this is outside, it's available somewhere else. The task that those who think critically about the law need to do is bring that into the law. And now, as soon as I present the problematic in this way, the question comes up with where am I located? Right? Am I located inside the discipline or outside the discipline? And this question gains significance because when I want to think about bringing queer theory into law, the kind of knowledge, legal knowledge that I will produce would essentially get marginalized within the law, because the dominant way of thinking within the law would say, but this is not really law, right? So when I'm teaching Saadat Hasan Manto's the new constitution in a law classroom, I do have to say, why is there a reading that is a short story in a law class? Why aren't we reading a judgment or, for example, a statute, right? So law produces its own ways of othering. But when I think about myself as somebody who's thinking with the law and with queer theory simultaneously, I don't necessarily want queer theory to produce its own others in the law, right? So instead of thinking about law and queer theory as categories that are in a relationship, a dialectical relationship of oppositionality, I would want to think about them as in a relationship of hospitality, rather than in a relationship of hostility, a relationship of hospitality. And in many ways, Patricia Williams is, again, a key figure who enables this way of thinking. How can we think about disciplinary or even political categories as categories, incommensurate categories? They don't fit together easily, but to not think about them necessarily as fundamentally oppositional to each other. Because what does oppositional thinking create? The legacy of the common law is the adversarial system. The adversarial system demands that one of the ways in which we win arguments is to prove that the other person is wrong. The reproduction of this cycle of adversariality in many ways produces carcerality. Carceral imagination is a product of the legacy of the adversarial common law system. So in many ways, I, for example, in a classroom space, can question carcerality by saying abolition of prisons. That could be one way of doing it. But I think there could be other ways of doing it as well, which is to think about how incommensurate categories, ideas, identities, in fact, share relationships of hospitality. These are problematic relationships. They are contradictory relationships, but they do share relationships of hospitality. Now, I possibly went completely in a random direction with the question, but I'm sorry if I haven't answered it at all. But just to say that I don't think about queer theory and law as categories of knowledge that are necessarily in opposition to each other.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for one last question. How can we engage with queer movements from a decolonial perspective? And if you can think through the language of the law, or what the law tells us.
Right. So one of the, I am suspicious of the language of decolonization, not to say that it isn't an unhelpful language, but I think it does not carry universal valence as we move through the world. Because histories of colonialism didn't play out in the same way as in Africa or South Asia or Australia or Canada. So there are very different experiences of colonialism produced very different kinds of subjectivities. The ways in which, for example, colonialism produced the effete Bengali man, for example, in the South Asian context, who could have been trained into civilization. It produced the beastly black body of the African man, who couldn't in fact be trained into civilization, but had to be tamed into civilization. So very different products that the colonial experience has produced in different places. The Australian indigenous response to colonialism does not speak the language of resistance the way in which, say, for example, the South Asian experience of colonial resistance does. So this is to say that, one, I don't think the language of decolonization or the vocabulary of the decolonial is portable. It doesn't move in a seamless fashion as we move through different parts of the world. The second thing is to say that it particularly loses its whatever radical valence it might carry in the current West as we enter a space like South Asia or India, to be specific. Just one illustration. India, that is Bharat, is the name of a new book published by Bloomsbury by a lawyer, a Supreme Court lawyer. It offers a particularly dangerous revisionist imagination of India, very much in line with the RSS objection to the constitution in that organizer quote that I shared earlier in my presentation. And who does this book get an endorsement from? It gets an endorsement from somebody like Walter Mignolo, the key leftist figure in decolonial studies. So clearly we see a particularly dangerous situation in the language of decolonization in the Indian context, where decolonization is akin to Hinduization of an Indian past, and which is why the language of decolonization also becomes problematic when we think about the Navtej Johar judgment, for instance. And what would we call, if you're reading Annihilation of Caste and the kind of resources that Ambedkar marshals through his citations, a whole of them, references to European history, European writers, what would it be to think about decolonizing AOC, for instance? So I think the particularly simplistic rivalry that the language of decolonization produces in the Indian context is very, very dangerous. So I'll be suspicious of its use, not to say that I want to discard it, but I would be suspicious of its use, because the RSS uses that very language that, for example, Walter Mignolo will also use, right? So we are bound together with the RSS if we are, and that's what I was saying. Look at the relationship of hospitality here. It's not a planned hospitality, but it's a hospitality that we cannot avoid if we speak the language of decolonization, how much ever we want to be opposed to the RSS.
That is an alarming proposition. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sircar, for such a rich conversation, and taking us through the multiple contradictions that we coexist with. Thank you so much, and the recording will be available over YouTube shortly.
Thank you, Neil. Just to say, I've been felt a little worried about constantly being called Professor Sircar. So,
okay, I'm sorry.
Called me Oishik, but
okay. Thank you, Oishik. It was lovely hosting you this evening. Have a good day.
And thank you. Thanks a lot, Neil, and to everybody in the Ashoka team for this opportunity, and to everybody who's signed in. Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everyone, and have a good